They used to be done on a big docket. So we'd all go to the Department of Labor and sit in the hallway, and we'd all chat for a long time. And I learned a lot going to those dockets, talking to other attorneys and that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
What are
Uh,
stipulations?
I was telling a story about how the dockets used to be before COVID.
I thought that was over.
You thought this,
I thought the
yeah,
story was over. You learned a
it
lot
wasn't.
at the dockets.
Yeah, that's a fine ending to that story. The
Welcome to Legalese episode 8. Excited to talk a little bit more, finish our discussion of work comp. And my name's Matt Patton. I guess I should mention that. And I am joined by my brother, Mike Patton. He is an attorney. He's been practicing for quite a long time and familiar with the work comp, lots of case types of law, but particularly work comp. So, how you doing today, Mike?
I'm doing great. We're just we've been working on a lot of different types of stuff, and I'm happy to be wrapping up this week and
Mm-hmm.
looking forward to the summer. My kids are finishing school next week, and so we're all thinking about summer and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So that's good.
Do you have any big summer plans?
Yeah, taking the kids to Florida.
Mm.
Cue the Taylor Swift music. The Although taking the kids to Florida and listening to that particular Taylor Swift song might not be the best. But anyway,
um,
big outing myself as big Swifty here.
oh, I mean, I think the whole world is. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think
and we're adjacent to the Chiefs, so you have to
yes,
be a Taylor Swift fan if you're in Chiefs Kingdom.
it's required.
It's
And then,
required.
so we're going to discuss, finish our discussion of work comp, and then we're going to talk about Viktor Frankle. Mike is a big fan of Viktor Frankle. Um, your favorite book of his is Man's Search for Meaning, I believe.
Yeah, yeah, and that's really, I think, his maybe not his only, but that's the work that he is most popular for. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll talk about that in the second half of the show. So without further ado, Mike, why don't you finish our discussion of work comp? Um, we left off, we kind of talked about what that preliminary hearing looked like. So what does the process look like from preliminary hearing to settlement?
Sure. So after a preliminary hearing, we discussed last time that the preliminary hearing is often where liability in a work comp case or responsibility would be maybe a layman's way of saying that is determined. So you've gotten through and it's a compensable case, meaning the employer and insurance carrier are going to cover your medical treatment and lost wages, all of that, and impairment. So from there, then you have an authorized treating doctor, and that authorized treating doctor is picked by the insurance company, and you proceed with treatment as determined by that authorized treating doctor. That can sometimes get a little muddled in terms of who's calling the shots, but the statute is clear. The authorized treating doctor, if they recommend it, the insurance company has to pay for it, and so that sometimes can be a source of contention during the case. But generally, they're going to determine your treatment, and you go. If at any point you as a claimant disagree with the authorized treating doctor in terms of what is wrong with you or uh, what treatment they recommend, you can get a second opinion through unauthorized medical. You have $500 for that. But you get through the treatment and you proceed to treatment until the authorized treating doctor determines that you are at maximum medical improvement. And I should say before that, there's stages in every treatment in a work comp case where you're on restrictions or you're off work, and there's an issue as to in that's described in the statute about accommodated work. And so generally, if you're put on restrictions by a doctor, your employer has to decide whether they can accommodate those restrictions or not. If they can't, then they owe you a weekly check. If they can, then you go and work with those restrictions, and then they're supposed to accommodate. those.
And if you
Uh,
are only allowed to work 10 hours a week, but previously you were working 40 hours a week, how does that work?
sure, great question. Then you're entitled to a benefit called temporary partial disability, which is calculated as what you were making before minus what you're making now times two-thirds, and you look at each individual week. So it Matt is an expert at preparing those temporary partial disability exhibits for preliminary hearings as it
I've
arise.
calculated temporary partial a number of times. That is true.
The I'll brag on Matt. I There was a judge years ago, Judge Howard, who was somewhat difficult to please. And if you were not prepared, he would kind of lay into you a little bit. Never happened to me. But anyway, I walked in with a very well organized exhibit on temporary partial disability, and he just raved. And so that was Matt's work, putting that together. So anyway, um, so you get through treatment, and then you're placed at maximum medical improvement, and that is what triggers uh, the the impairment ratings that we've discussed. So then
What
you're
is
assigned it.
what does maximum medical improvement mean?
That means you're as good as the doctor thinks that you will get. So there's no immediate treatment uh, that they're recommending to improve. Like another round of physical therapy isn't going to make you better. You're at maximum medical improvement. That doesn't mean your all your symptoms are alleviated. It doesn't even mean that you won't need treatment in the future. It just means there's no current recommendation for treatment.
Okay, so that
Good
you're at
question.
MMI, and then you might move in toward getting that impairment rating looked
Mhm.
at.
Yeah. And then we've discussed how that impairment rating goes into a calculation that would determine either a settlement or award. But from there, procedurally, once you have that impairment rating, you can move to what's called a pre-hearing settlement conference. Uh, we file for that. And the pre-hearing settlement conference has really moved into what I think of as a pre-trial. So it's analogous to a pre-trial in civil court. And so we discuss stipulations, we discuss what evidence we're presenting. Very rarely do we discuss settlement at the pre-hearing settlement conference. They used to be done on a big docket. So we'd all go to the Department of Labor and sit in the hallway, and we'd all chat for a long time. And I learned a lot going to those dockets, talking to other attorneys and that
Yeah.
sort of thing.
What are
Uh,
stipulations?
I was telling a story about how the dockets used to be before COVID.
I thought that was over.
You thought this?
I thought the
Yeah,
story was over. You learned a
it
lot
wasn't.
at the dockets.
Yeah, that's a fine ending to that story. The
Sorry.
I was just gonna say now we don't do that, and I miss seeing all the
Oh
other
yeah,
attorneys on the docket.
because all the hearings are
All those
digital
all
Zoom.
those hearings are either done by Zoom or by phone now,
Mm.
which saves a lot of time because they're very short hearings, like
Hmm.
maybe maybe 10 minutes. Really, they're 5-minute hearings unless there's particularly complex issues. So it does make sense to do those by phone, but it was a really useful time in terms of networking,
Hmm.
getting to know other attorneys, getting to know other claimants' attorneys. Because if I were new starting out now, it's like I would never meet other claimants' attorneys. I just wouldn't. And so, anyway,
And just
that
yet
is
another
that is
example of how technology is increasing atomization,
that's right.
individualism.
Yeah, I'll get off my old man soapbox. But anyway, you were asking what a stipulation is.
Yeah,
A stipulation is when the two parties agree on an issue that would otherwise have to be decided by a fact finder or a judge.
got it.
So you can stipulate to the average weekly wage, which is a common stipulation. So we agree that the average wage is this. And so then we have an agreement as to the compensation rate for that case. And you can see why that would be an easy thing to stipulate to. The facts are the facts, and you just look at the wage and you can calculate that. Now, we're attorneys and we can find things to fight about within that pretty regularly. So I'm sure if there are any other work comp attorneys watching, they'd be like, well, we don't always stipulate to that. But there's always, I get, I've I've had some respondents attorneys, so insurance defense attorneys, uh, give me a hard time, like, oh, you're using that claimant math. So anyway,
My math is impeccable. Thank you very much.
that's right. That's right. So that another example of a stipulation you can stipulate to compensability. Usually that's at that point we've already litigated that. So prevailing factor might be stipulated to, and then uh, that the injury was arising out of and in the course of employment. That's a common stipulation. So
And those are the things that would decide compensability, that the injury, the prevailing factor for the injury was the incident in question, and the incident was a work related incident.
yeah, and prevailing factor bears some explanation. That is a requirement in the statute that um, the prevailing factor for an injury and the need for treatment has to be the work or the work event. And uh, and so that is a defense for employers, and kind of the thing you might think about is, well, someone's had a bad back their entire life. They go work at um, wherever,
Amazon.
Amazon, and then they say, "Oh, my back was hurting," and so they could conceivably say, "No, the prevailing factor is this previous injury, not the work," and that could be a defense. We have not found that to be a terribly effective defense lately, and that's because of uh, appellate decisions that have determined, well, you look at whether there's a physical change in the body. And if there's a physical change in the body, then it's a new injury. And so that, from my perspective, makes my argument clear. Well, I'm looking at, well, what changed? So is there an MRI? Is there a difference in the disc space between a prior MRI? And if there's a previous injury, you usually have a prior MRI and you can compare them. And even then, you can argue that there's a muscle strain that's new, or if there's swelling, you can argue that. So usually it's not hard to prove that there is a new physical change. Just kind of determines, well, how much is prior, how much is new, and you have to sort that out with medical testimony.
Okay,
So
so you've been placed on MMI, you've gotten that rating. Where do we go from there?
And after the pre-hearing settlement conference, the judge will then clear you for regular hearing, and the regular hearing is the trial. And in work comp, they separate out the submission of evidence. So at the regular hearing, you'll usually take the claimant's testimony. So the claimant will testify as to what happened to them, and they'll get cross-examined by opposing counsel. And then you're given terminal dates, which is a period of time in which you have to submit the rest of your testimony. So if you're going to have someone else testify, you have to have them testify at a deposition, which is then submitted to the administrative law judge. So usually that's your medical testimony. And occasionally, if there's other witnesses that you need and you didn't have them come to the regular hearing, you do that then. And so you go take your expert's testimony. The respondent's terminal date is usually 30 days beyond yours. They take their medical testimony, and of course we would then cross-examine their doctor, and that's submitted and then you've got a case submitted for judgment. And the judge would then use those calculations and make determinations, findings of facts, determinations of law, and calculate an award at that point. The other thing that they decide at those cases is future medical. So, future medical, you have a right to future medical that's related to that injury uh, if it's awarded. And it's awarded based on whether it's more likely true than not that you'll need future medical. And there's presumptions under the new law that favor what the treating doctor has said. Uh, and so if you can prove that there's a need for future medical, then you get awarded that future medical, and then you can, through a post award medical application, get additional treatment.
And
And
you sometimes I've noticed that opposing counsel will offer a settlement to close out future
Mhm.
medical. I'm sure it depends on situations, but what do you generally think of those offers?
Yeah, it depends. With the changes to the law, that that is more often going to be a reasonable thing to do. However, uh, you take those very cautiously generally because you're closing out your right to additional treatment through workers' compensation. And under after the Affordable Care Act, regular health insurance would then have to cover whatever treatment that you have. Uh, but Medicare, very specifically, will not treat you or will not provide coverage, more accurately,
For
for a work-related injury. So you should not, if it is going to be an ongoing issue, then you'd almost be better off having a judge make a determination that there's no future medical than even settling it if you're going to be a Medicare recipient within uh, soon, you know?
hmm
And, everyone is going to be a Medicare recipient eventually
hmm
if they live long enough. So,
Yeah,
so that's something that you have to consider very carefully, and you should document well in the settlement that uh, it there's medical evidence that there should not be future medical. And usually, if the treating doctor specifically says that, then that's a significant fact to look at and
cool.
something that you should put in the settlement documents because Medicare puts a great deal of weight in their guidance as to what the treating doctor has said about that,
Cool.
about the issue of future medical.
I will, at the end of this video, there'll be a link to our video about calculating scheduled injury awards. So if you want to know more about how that works, there'll be some other, we have another video on that that might be helpful if you want to figure out how much you might expect in that settlement award for scheduled injuries. We'll do some other videos about other types of situations down the road. But I think that maybe can put a bow on it for work comp discussion for the week. So now we get to talk about philosophy. Viktor Frankle. Mike, why are you so interested in Viktor Frankle?
Well, I read his book for the first time maybe 3 years ago, maybe not that long ago, and I just was fascinated by it. What the book is about is he breaks it into two parts. And the first part is just talking about his experience as a Holocaust survivor. So the book is literally about the Holocaust. And documenting the horrors of going through that and what he was thinking about. And the second part of the book is he tries to draw meaning uh, from that or purpose. And to me, it just becomes this really beautiful expression of what it means to be human, in that they attempted to dehumanize uh, the Jewish people in that at every turn. But what was most human about them uh, remained And the book, if you haven't read it, go read it. It's excellent. Um, and so he determined a couple different things, and kind of his famous quote that gets repeated a lot of different places. It's kind of one of the one of the main sources in Seven Habits of Highly Effective People. It starts with this quote, um, but it's he says, between stimulus and response, there is a space, and in that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. And at another point, he says, um, everything can be taken from a man, but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, is to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way. And remember, the context with which he is saying this is the most horrific context that you can imagine. And he's saying that within stories of people who give up hope. And and he observed that what the difference between uh, people who would die in their bunks and people who would survive onto the next day of repeated horrors was um, that they would choose hope. And once people gave up hope, then they would fade very quickly. And so he walks through how he chose hope and the things that he would think about, and he really comes up with three things that matter or that bring his life meaning. And those three things were essentially meaningful work. And so he was thinking about he's a clinical psychologist. Um, and so he was thinking about his work and piecing that together, because if I'm remembering correctly, they took his actual textbook away from him. And so he was working it out in his head throughout his time at the internment camp. And so that brought him immense meaning, that he was wanted to survive to be able to share this experience and share his work. Um, and and so having work that is creative and aligned with a greater purpose brings meaning to people's lives. So that's an important thing for people to have, is meaningful work that's creative. The next is essentially would be categorized as experiential, but he calls it love, and that's also relational. So the second source of meaning is love through relationships, and those are the people in your life, and that is absolutely necessary to having a meaningful life, is have people that you connect with, that you love. And for him, uh, he he was thinking about his wife constantly.
Mm.
He was separated from her, but thinking about her. And he described he would have conversations with her in his head,
Mm-hmm.
and that brought him kind of an inward strength. Just
Mm-hmm.
that relationship, even though she was gone, but that relationship was meaningful to him. And then finally, the most mysterious is there is meaning in suffering, or the ability to find meaning in suffering is is key. And so suffering for a purpose is kind of a fundamental um, key to life, or key to finding meaning in life. And that is also kind of a double-edged sword, because he also says the worst kind of suffering is suffering with no purpose, which is what he
Mm-hmm.
found himself in, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
he's in a situation where there is just meaningless suffering going on all around him. They were trying to strip these people of their connections
Mm-hmm.
and humanity.
So did you get a feeling, a sense of how he found meaning in that experience of suffering?
For him, it was, I need to get through and be able to explain this on the other side. I need to save my work, and I need to, uh, and the relationships with the other people in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so he would go
It
ahead.
makes me think of there's a movie I saw that came out I think last year called Beautiful Days, um, and it's it may be the most boring movie I've ever seen in my life, but it's also wonderful. It's about a guy who's a janitor in Japan, and he cleans toilets for a living, and he has this really simple life, and yet he seems to be really filled with joy, moment to moment, day to day. And so when you talk about meaningful work, he was able to find this sense of meaning in his job as a janitor in Japan. Also, weirdly, public toilets in Japan are beautiful. I did not know that until I watched this movie. And then he makes this connection with um, his niece, and that produces a lot of joy and I think meaning. So those two, at least aspects of what you're talking about in this movie, Beautiful Days, were really highlighted. Um, but yeah, I think that's really true. That if you can find meaning in your work, and it sometimes I think we can get distracted by thinking in order for my work to have meaning, it has to be something big. But I think you can find meaning in even the smallest kinds of work. Um, and certainly that second point is true about relational connection. I think I am still struggling with that third idea, finding meaning in suffering.
Y-
Um,
Yeah, and it's suffering for a cause was definitely a part of that. And how I think of that, I think of two things. One, I think of Jesus's call on our life. Like he calls Christians and his followers to take up their cross, meaning a symbol of suffering, and follow Jesus, follow in his ways. And his way was I'm going to give up my life for other people, right?
mhm,
And so that to me is the connection to your whole life, like that
mhm,
suffering uh for other people is the call of Christ. Now, that is a really weird thing to say um within, my context. I've I'm very, very blessed. I've got um all these things that are make life easy. But I think everyone, and Viktor Frankle says, like suffering, you can't get around it. Suffering is a part of the human experience. And so you take that and then you suffer for a cause. And that is what brings life meaning, which is a little bit different. You look at Buddhism, which has a lot to say about suffering and a lot of profound things to say about suffering. But the central tenet is you're going to suffer no matter what. And so the story of Buddha is the story of the prince who had everything, but was still suffering. And then he gives up everything and lives a life of poverty, and he's still suffering. And so that's profound. It's like the human experience is to suffer. And so there's no way around that. Like that's just a part of the place we find ourselves. Uh, and and I think it's courageous to then say, okay, well, that's where we are. We're going to suffer for others or for a cause that's greater than ourselves. And I think that is a significant part of the gospel and what Jesus was asking of us. Um, it's one side of it. There's a
mhm,
lot more to it. And so sometimes we think of in our brand of Christianity, we think of, okay, well, Jesus suffered and died, and I just accept that, and then I get salvation and I'm going to heaven. It's like, well, yeah, that is certainly one side of it too, but there's a call within that to suffer with him, and that means that you sacrifice. And what you sacrifice, I think, is subject to the context of your life. So that
Yeah.
I'm getting a little away from Viktor Frankl there,
No,
but
I think that's helpful, and I also think when we think about suffering, one of the things that can make it feel um, overwhelming is that feeling when it feels meaningless, when it feels purposeless. Um, and I think I've done a little bit of study in school on pastoral counseling and care, and one book that I really liked in that space was Five Smooth Stones for Pastoral Ministry by Eugene Peterson, and he talks a lot about um, the meaning making process as part of that sort of counseling journey, and and I think the narrative that when we have an experience, we do interpret the experience, and a narrative comes forward out of the experience, and the substance of the narrative, the direction of the narrative, has a lot to do with our experience of the suffering itself. And so, I think it's really important as we do experience suffering to think about how we're framing that suffering through the narrative that we're telling ourselves, and how we talk about it with other people. Um, is it a narrative that um, describes God as a villain? You know, that is an interpretation of the events that I think sometimes feels like it makes sense. Um, but the way that we describe the experience and the way that we narrate the experience and the story that comes out of that has a huge plays a huge role in how we experience that suffering. Um, so,
and and can even and that was what he talks about in the later part of his book. Viktor Frankl talks about logotherapy, which is essentially reframing with meaning the context of your suffering. And so he talks about someone who hated their job and it was boring, and in one in one of the context he was like, well, change your job to something that you find meaningful. But then the other context was, well, you were suffering for a purpose and you were suffering to provide for your family, even though you hated it. That's a noble thing. And reframing that was very helpful for his patient.
mhm,
But you can do that with all kinds of things, providing it's not inventing something, it's seeing what's there, and you can reframe the context um, immensely. And honestly, I think that's some of what Viktor Frankl was doing in writing the book. He's reframing the context of this meaningless suffering that was inflicted upon him that was evil. And instead you have this picture of this immense strength and goodness in the human spirit as opposed to this horrible evil.
mhm, yeah.
That
And I
so
think there's a lot of power in just being aware that we get to notice the narratives that we're talking about and how we're talking about things, and there's power in just being aware of it and noticing the narrative. So,
yeah, and that's this, the space between stimulus and response is how you're going to frame your attitude around that.
mhm,
And that's really hard to do in difficult contexts, but it is possible. And I'm thinking of like parenting. It's like I think all the time, it's like, well, you can't give a kid context. Um, but I think I am supposed to teach them that they get to provide the context. They can decide, or you can't give a kid not context, perspective is what I meant to
mhm,
say. Perspective on, the little bit of suffering that's got, a
mhm,
5-year-old, a little bit of suffering goes big and it's
mhm,
terrible. And you're like, you're going
mhm.
to be okay. I know
Yeah,
that's all you can think about is your stub toe or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But
The meaning doesn't work very well coming from the outside. It works the best when it's intrinsic, and
yeah,
the new narrative comes from me.
yeah.
Um, well, I think we're at time here, so thanks for hanging in there with us, and we'll see you next week.
And maybe next week we'll talk about a more cheerful subject, but
We'll try to be
suffering in the
cheery next week.
Holocaust.